No Omega walked into the blood court willingly. Senna knew this the moment the iron gates swallowed the last of the torchlight behind her and she stood alone in the red-veined corridor, her heartbeat the only soft thing in a hall built entirely from stone and consequence. She had not come willingly. She had come because there was no one else, because the heir was dying, and because the man who would have stopped her from doing this, the man who had looked at her once like she was something that mattered, had signed the order himself that sent her away 3 years ago. She carried the remedy in a clay vial against her sternum, warm from her skin. She told herself that was the only reason she was still walking. The blood court smelled the way she remembered it from stories her mother used to tell, old iron and pine resin and something beneath both, something wolfish and sovereign that pressed against the back of her throat like a hand. The sconces burned with a flame that was almost violet. The stone floor was the color of a wound. Senna kept walking. She was not the same Omega who had left this territory with nothing but a travel pack and a sealed letter she was not permitted to read. She had learned things in 3 years that the blood court had never seen fit to teach her. She had learned how to be still inside her own fear. She had learned which roots grew in the killing cold of the northern reach, and how to render them into something that could pull a child back from the edge of a fever that shouldn't exist. A fever that no court physician had been able to name. She knew its name. She also knew that walking into the blood court with that knowledge made her valuable, and valuable things in this palace had a way of disappearing. The guards had let her through the outer gate because she'd given her name to the youngest sentry, barely more than a pup, his hands too big for his gauntlets, and watched his expression shift from bored contempt to something that looked almost like shock. He'd sent the message in with a runner and she'd waited in the wind for 40 minutes before the gate opened without explanation. She didn't ask for one. She walked. The corridor opened into the antechamber of the inner court, and there were 3 beaters waiting with their arms crossed and their faces arranged into the specific blankness of people performing neutrality. One of them looked at her throat, the unmarked curve of it, and she saw him note it and look away. Unmated. Unclaimed. Alone. She let them look. "The Alpha King will see you," the tallest beater said, and something in Senna's chest shifted, not toward fear, but toward the specific pain of a thing that had never fully healed, pressing on a nerve it had been pressing for 3 years. She followed them through the doors. Senna had been 6 years old the first time she saw the inner sanctum of the blood court, and she'd thought it looked like the inside of a god's throat. The ceiling vaulted so far above the floor that clouds could have lived there. The walls were hung with banners in deep red and black, the sigil of the Ashvaran line, a wolf with its head turned backward, watching the past while it walked into the future. She had thought it was a sad sigil, even then. She remembered thinking that, standing beside her mother on the marble floor, both of them attendants for a delegation her mother had translated for. She'd been too young to translate anything. She'd been old enough to notice the young Alpha at the far end of the hall, 16 and already holding stillness like a weapon, his dark eyes moving across the room with a precision that made her feel, obscurely and absurdly, seen. He hadn't been looking at her. He'd been looking at the delegation. But she'd felt it all the same. Her mother had died when Senna was 11. By then they were residents of the blood court, translators and archivists, low enough in station that no one objected to their presence, valuable enough that they were permitted it. Senna had grown up in the East Wing Library, learning languages because they were everywhere and free, learning scent reading because she had a sensitivity no one had trained and no one had thought to suppress, learning the particular grammar of a place that ran on power and blood debt and the absolute authority of the Ashvaran line. Learning, without meaning to, the face of the man who would become the Alpha King. His name was Kylen Ashvaran, and he had been terrible and magnetic and so deeply lonely that Senna had felt it as a physical sensation every time he came within 30 feet of her, which was not often, and then was more often, and then one summer was constant. She'd been 19. He'd been 24. The Alpha who would inherit the blood court in 2 years when his father's illness took the last of his strength. She had not planned to fall in love with him. She didn't think he had planned it either. She thought it had happened the way most honest things happened, not by decision but by accumulation, the slow weight of mornings shared in the library when he came to read war histories and found her already there, the conversations that started formally and ended somewhere else entirely, the afternoon he'd said something she disagreed with and she'd told him so and he'd gone so still that she'd thought she'd made a fatal error, and then he'd laughed. She had never heard him laugh before. It changed everything. She did not have a name for what was building between them, because the name for it, mate, fated mate, the bond that the moon chose and the blood confirmed, was not a name she allowed herself to use. He was the heir to the blood court. She was an omega with no pack, no rank, no political value. The distance between them was not metaphor. It was the kind of distance that had teeth. But the Bond had not asked her permission. She knew it the day he walked into the library from the training yard, still sweating, his shirt unlaced, a cut above his left eyebrow that had already stopped bleeding, and she smelled him before she heard him, and her whole body turned toward the door the way a plant turns toward a window. She'd pretended to be reading. He'd sat across from her without asking. "You know your hands are shaking," he said. She'd looked at her hands. They were cold, she'd said. He'd looked at the fire blazing in the hearth 3 feet away. He'd looked back at her. He had not said anything. But something in his face, the careful blankness of it, the way the precision he usually wore cracked along one edge, told her that he knew. That he had felt the same thing and was doing the same thing she was, which was choosing, deliberately, not to name it. They were at the beginning of what she now understood was the most painful kind of love, the kind that both people know about and neither will say. For 8 months, it had been like that. Conversations that ran long. Books recommended through the medium of leaving them in places he would find them. One morning in early winter when the heat in the East Wing failed and she'd come to the library to find him already there with a fire built up and a second cup of tea set out, still steaming, as though he'd known she was coming, as though he had gotten up and made it while thinking of her. She had sat down and drunk the tea and not said a word about it. She had also not slept properly for a week after. The Bond deepened the way rivers deepen, not suddenly but irrevocably, carving its path into ground that would keep the shape of it forever. Senna felt it as a constant low warmth behind her breastbone, a certainty she had not chosen and could not discharge. When he was angry she felt the shape of it before she saw his face. When he was grieving, his father's decline was steep and public, she felt that too, a hollow pull in the left side of her chest that she had no right to feel and felt anyway. She had never told him. She had come close, twice. Once on the eastern parapet in the blue hour before dawn when he'd found her watching the tree line and stood beside her without speaking for so long that the words had risen in her throat like water. She was his. She had always been his. The bond was real and she did not know what to do with it, and then he'd exhaled and said, quietly, that he thought his father would not survive the spring. And she'd held the words back and put her hand over his on the parapet railing instead, and he'd turned his hand over and held hers, and they'd stood like that until the sun was fully up and the guards changed shift below and the world became visible and public again. He'd let go of her hand first. She'd understood. The second time was 3 weeks before the rejection. She had been foolish enough to let herself be seen, let the warmth she felt show in her face, in the way she moved toward him across a room, in the particular attention she gave to his voice in a crowd full of voices. She had not meant to. She'd been tired and he'd been kind, and for one unguarded moment she'd looked at him the way she actually felt about him. An elder beta woman had seen it. Senna had watched the woman's eyes catalogue the look and file it. She had known, then, that the grace period was over. She had been right. 3 weeks later, Kailen Ashvaran had called her to his study, not the library, the study, which was formal and political and not their space, and he'd stood behind his desk and he'd said, with the particular stillness that she now understood was not coldness but self-control held so tightly it left bruises, that her continued presence in the blood court was no longer tenable. He had used that word. Tenable. He said the court required him to present a formal mating in the coming months. That certain members of the council had raised concerns, he did not name them, she knew their faces, about his associations. That for her own safety, and for the good of the court, it would be best for her to take a placement at the Northern Archives. That he had already arranged it. That the position was generous and respected and she would be well cared for. He said all of this looking slightly to the left of her face. She had listened. She had kept her hands still. She had felt the bond between them screaming, that was the only word for it, a wordless animal sound in the center of her chest, the sound of something tearing that had grown slowly enough to become load-bearing. When he finished, she'd said, "You signed the order before you called me in." He hadn't denied it. "When do I leave?" "In the morning," he said. "I thought more time would be." "In the morning," she repeated. Not a question. A confirmation. She'd looked at him then, directly, and she'd let him see it, not the love. She kept the love behind her back teeth where it could not reach him, but the knowledge. She'd let him see that she knew what he was, and what he felt, and what he was choosing to do with it. He'd looked back at her. The crack in his face, the one she'd seen in the library the day she first felt the bond, had split wide. For one terrible moment he looked like a man standing at the edge of something he was about to fall from. Then he looked away. She left in the morning. She did not read the letter. She did not read it for 6 months, and then she read it in a single sitting in her room at the Northern Archives, and then she put it in the cold hearth and burned it without reacting because there was no one there to react to and she had work in the morning. She never told anyone what it said. She came north carrying his words inside her like a coal, not burning, not quite dead. She found the work of the archives absorbing. She found the quiet of the northern reach something she could breathe in. She found other Omegas who had their own scars, their own accommodations with a world that had not been arranged with them in mind, and she found that she liked them, honestly, without performance. She did not heal from Kylen Ashvaran. She did not pretend to. What she did was construct herself around the fact of him, build a life in the shape of someone who was still intact, and mostly that construction held. On certain mornings, when the light was a particular shade of blue and the cold made the air taste like iron, she would feel the ghost of the bond because it hadn't gone anywhere, it had only been denied. It pulsed low and quiet like something deciding whether to survive, and she would feel it and breathe through it and make her tea and go to work. That was what she did with it. She was doing that for 3 years when the messenger came with the word about the heir. The heir was not Seelan's child, he had not mated. She'd heard this through the careful neutral channels of archival communication, noted it with the same discipline she applied to everything about him, filed it. The heir was his nephew, his brother's son, born under complicated circumstances and brought to the blood court after his brother's death 2 years ago. The boy was 7. His name was Ori. She had never met him. But she knew his fever. The description in the message routed through 3 separate archives before it reached her, accompanied by a note that said simply your expertise in northern botanical remedy has been requested, was precise enough that she recognized it immediately. The fever ran in phases. It burned high for 6 hours, then leveled, then spiked again without warning. It did not respond to standard treatment. The child hallucinated during the peaks. He had been ill for 19 days. Senna knew what was causing it because she had catalogued a near-identical case 11 months ago, in a village 2 days' ride from the Northern Archives. A child of 5. She had spent 3 days in that village with the plant woman who'd called for help, and together they had identified a mold that grew on a specific northern pine, a mold that, once inhaled in sufficient quantity during a vulnerable window of immune development, lodged in the respiratory pathways and produced a toxin the body could not clear on its own. The child in the village had lived. She'd spent 4 months after that developing the remedy into something transportable. She had it in her satchel when she read the message. She'd been packed within the hour. She had not let herself think about Kylen until she was on horseback and the Northern Archives were 3 hours behind her and the road had committed her to its direction. Then she had thought about him, methodically, the way she thought about dangerous things, with full attention and no flinching. She thought about the study and the desk and the letter she'd burned. She thought about the heir, a child of 7 who was dying, and she thought about the specific moral arithmetic of what she was choosing, and she resolved it cleanly. The child came first, everything else was secondary. Her own feelings on the matter were not relevant to whether a child lived or died. She thought, I am not going back for him. She thought, I am going back despite him. And she had ridden south for 4 days in the cold, alone, and arrived at the blood court's outer gate with the vial warm against her skin. The doors of the inner sanctum opened before she reached them. He was standing 30 feet away, at the center of the audience floor, and the first thing she noticed was not his face but the fact that he was alone. No advisors. No counsel. No attendants at his back. The Alpha King of the Blood Court stood in his own hall like a man waiting for a sentence he'd already argued himself into accepting. The second thing she noticed was that he looked like 3 years had cost him more than they had cost her. She stopped walking at a distance she calculated would keep her outside the immediate range of the bond's physical pull. She had learned this was possible, keeping herself at the edge of it, where she could feel it without it overcoming her discipline. It was not comfortable. It was what she had. You came, he said. His voice was the same. That was its own problem. I came for the heir, she said. Where is the child? Something moved across his face. Not quite hurt, she knew what his hurt looked like. She'd catalogued it, but something adjacent. Something that had been pressing on the same nerve for a long time. He's in the East Tower. The physicians are with him. He paused. Senna. I'll need access to the child immediately, an open fire, and clean water that's been brought to a full boil and then cooled. I'll also need the court physician removed from the room. Not because they're inadequate, because the treatment process will look alarming and I don't want interference at a critical stage. His jaw tightened. You could greet me first. Your nephew is dying, she said. We can observe courtesies when he isn't. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned and gave the instruction to the beater who'd appeared silently at the edge of the hall. Escort her, arrange what she's asked for, clear the physician. She followed the escort. She did not look back. The East Tower smelled like fever and fear. Senna had been in enough sick rooms to know the smell, a particular sweetness beneath the sourness of sweat, the sharp overlay of whatever remedies had been tried. The child was in a large bed, too large for him, which made him look smaller and more fragile than he probably was in good health. His hair was damp. His breathing was even, which meant they were in the low phase of the fever cycle, the false improvement that the court physicians had probably been mistaking for recovery each time. She set her satchel on the table by the window and took out the vial and the dried materials she'd wrapped in oilcloth and began to work. She lost herself in it for a while. That was the reliable mercy of skilled work. It required enough of her attention that the rest of her, the part that was standing in the same building as Kylen Ashvaran for the first time in 3 years, had to wait. She prepared the remedy in stages, each one requiring precision, the boiled water cooling to the exact temperature she needed, the dried components rehydrating slowly, the final compound developing its color, a pale amber that darkened toward rust at the edges, exactly right. She was on the 3rd stage when the door opened and she knew without turning who had come in. She kept her hands steady. He hasn't taken food in 4 days, Kylen said. He was not speaking to the child. He was speaking to her, from just inside the doorway, which told her he was respecting the boundary she'd set at the distance she'd stopped at in the hall. He'd read her. He'd always read her. He'll be able to eat after the 2nd dose, she said. The toxin suppresses appetite and causes nausea. Once we begin clearing it, that should resolve within 12 hours. Toxin, he said. The physicians said infection. The physicians weren't wrong that something is living where it shouldn't. They were wrong about what and where. This is a mold-produced toxin. It entered through inhalation. She picked up the cooled water and measured. Has the child spent time in northern growth pine forests recently? Within the last 3 to 4 months. A silence. Then, my brother's estate. Before he passed. The boy stayed there 2 months, with the staff, while the legal arrangements were made. There's a mold that grows on certain northern pines in late summer, during specific humidity conditions. Children under 10 are particularly susceptible because of how their immune systems process particulate matter. The good news is the toxin, once we begin extracting it, clears quickly. 2 to 3 days of treatment and he should be past danger. She turned to look at the child, not at Kylen. He's strong. You can see it in how he's been fighting. Each time the fever peaks, he comes back down. That's not the toxin doing that, that's him. She heard something happen in the room behind her, a sound that wasn't quite a sound, the held breath quality of a man standing very still while something happens to him that he can't stop. She had heard that before. She had spent 8 months learning every variety of it. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides and his face open in a way that the blood court was never supposed to see, and he was looking at the child in the bed with an expression that contained everything: grief, exhaustion, and an love so helpless it came off him in waves. He loved the boy. She hadn't known that, and now she did, and it cost her something she couldn't afford. She turned back to the remedy. You should sleep, she said. The first dose takes 3 hours to work fully. I'll send word if anything changes. I'm staying. She had expected that. Then sit down and don't touch anything on this table. He pulled a chair to the edge of the room and sat, and she finished the preparation and administered the first dose, and the child stirred briefly but didn't wake, and then she sat down too, in the chair by the window, and there was silence in the room that was not comfortable and not hostile and had no name she was willing to assign it. Outside the tower window, the blood court's courtyard was lit with the violet-tinted sconces. The moon was high and half full. Senna pulled her knees to her chest and watched it and kept the part of herself that knew exactly where Kylen was in the room on a very short lead. He spoke first. The letter, he said. Did you read it? She kept her eyes on the moon. I burned it. Another silence. All of it, he asked. Every word. A pause. After I read it. She heard him breathe. Then you know what I didn't have the courage to say to your face. I know what you wrote when you thought the distance was permanent, she said. It doesn't change what you chose. No, he agreed. It doesn't. The child shifted in the bed, his breathing deepening, and Senna watched him and felt the remedy beginning to work. She could smell the change in his fever, the subtle shift toward something clearing rather than compounding. She let the relief of that settle her. Why did you really send the message, she said. Not an accusation. A real question. Because he's dying and you're the only person who knew what was wrong, Kylen said. Simple. No performance in it. You could have sent the description to any northern herbalist. I sent it to you. Why? A very long pause. She counted her own breaths through it. Because I trust you, he said. More than anyone. More than I have any right to after what I did. Because when I knew he was dying and I couldn't find the answer and I was running out of time, your face was the first thing I saw. Your knowledge. You. And I knew that if you were willing to come, he would live. She said nothing. And because, he said, quieter, I wanted to see you. Don't, she said. I know. 3 years, Kylen. You had 3 years to. I know. She pressed her mouth together. The moon sat in the window, patient, shedding its cold light. I am not here to forgive you, she said. I'm here for the child. I know that too. Stop agreeing with everything I say. It's unnerving. He made a small sound, almost involuntary, that was the cousin of the laugh she'd heard once in a library when she was 19. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and radiate outward, and she had to work to hold the line. The child's name, she learned over the next several hours, was Ori, which she'd known, and he was 7, which she'd known, and he was apparently ungovernable when healthy. Kylen described him with a helpless specificity that made it clear he'd been watching the boy closely since he arrived, memorizing him with the same precision he'd applied to war histories and the political character of foreign delegations, and that this too was love, just love wearing unfamiliar clothes on a man who had never been shown how to wear it openly. She administered the second dose at 3 in the morning. At 4, the fever broke. Not dramatically, the child didn't convulse or cry out. The sweat simply stopped, and his color changed from the dull gray-yellow of fever to something more recognizably a child's color, and his breathing went loose and deep and real. Senna checked him, thorough and methodical, and then stood at the foot of his bed and let the relief wash through her fully, because he was alive, and she had done this, and that was enough. Kylen was on his feet. He's going to be fine, she said. 2 more doses over the next 2 days and the toxin will be fully cleared. He should wake in an hour or 2 asking for something to eat. He crossed the room without thinking. She could tell that because he was normally so deliberate and his hands were on her face before she could step back. Just his palms, cupping her jaw, tilted up slightly so he could look at her, and she felt the bond ignite with the contact in a way that was not metaphor or feeling but something cellular, a recognition that traveled from her skin to her spine and back, a sound that had no pitch. She grabbed his wrists. Not to push him away. She told herself later, in the careful accounting she applied to moments that mattered, that she held his wrists because the physical contact had unsteadied her and she needed something to hold on to. That was true. It was also true that she didn't pull his hands from her face. Senna, he said. Don't, she said again, but the word had no strength in it. 3 years of construction, the careful architecture of someone who had learned to live around the shape of a loss, and he was looking at her with his hands on her face and she could feel every pulse of the bond between them, live and immediate and nothing like the quiet ghost she'd been managing in the north. I told you in the letter, he said, that I had made an error so fundamental I didn't know how to name it. That the night I sent you away was the worst night of my life, not because of what I lost but because of what I chose, and that those are different things, and I had spent months learning the difference. That's a very articulate letter for a man who looked at the wall when he said goodbye, she said. His thumbs moved. Just slightly. Against her cheekbones. I wrote it 17 times, he said. The others were worse. She looked at him. She let herself, fully, the way she hadn't in the hall because she'd needed the distance. She looked at what 3 years had done to him. The grey at his temple. The way the precision in his face had given way to something rawer, less armored, not weakness, something harder than weakness, the particular look of someone who had stopped pretending the armor was comfortable. You have to understand, she said, carefully, that I am not the same person who left. I know. I am not going to be what I was. The deference. The invisibility. I won't perform smallness for this court. I would not ask you to. Your counsel. The counsel answers to me, he said, and the Alpha King was fully present in his voice, steady and absolute, the tone that had nothing to do with coldness and everything to do with the weight he'd been trained from birth to carry. Not the other way. I spent 3 years learning that distinction too, and it cost more than I'm going to describe to you in this room with my nephew sleeping 6 feet away. Ask me again when he's well. She became aware that she was still holding his wrists. That neither of them had moved. The child has to be the priority right now, she said. Yes. I mean it. Everything else after. Yes. His forehead dropped to hers, a single contact, barely a breath's width of space between them, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and she heard him exhale, fully, like a man setting down something he had carried without rest. Yes. Everything after. Just stay. Don't go back to the Northern Archives tonight. Stay until he's well. She closed her eyes. The bond between them was not quiet. It had not been quiet since she'd walked through the iron gates. It was a living pull between two people who had been in each other's gravity for so long that the orbit had never fully decayed, only stretched, and she was close enough now that the stretch was collapsing, and she could feel the shape of what it would mean to let it. She thought about the woman she'd built in the north. Strong. Intact. Not dependent on this. She thought, I am not saying yes to him. I am saying yes to what happens when I finally stop running from what I am. I'll stay until he's well, she said. Kylen lifted his head. He looked at her in the dim light of the sick room, with his hand still on her face and the sleeping child behind her, and he looked like every version of himself she'd memorized, the careful one, the precise one, the one who laughed once in a library and changed her life, and underneath all of them, the one who had been waiting. He let his hands drop. She stepped back. They sat back down on opposite sides of the room and waited for Ori to wake, and when he did, groggy and querulous and almost immediately demanding food, Senna answered his first confused question about who she was with the simple truth. She was the person who'd brought the thing that made him better. Ori looked at her with Seelan's eyes, dark and precise, and said, Do you live here? She said, Not yet. She felt Kylen go very still on the other side of the room and did not look at him. The council session was called on the morning of the second day, when Ori was sitting up eating and complaining loudly about the quality of the broth. Senna was in the east corridor outside the council chamber, not present at the session itself, because she had not been invited and had not asked to be and was fine with this. She was not fine with whatever was being said in there. She had excellent hearing and she was standing 20 feet from the closed doors. An Omega with no pack standing, no claim, no title. The heir is alive because of her, my lord. That is precisely the problem. She has demonstrated value, she doesn't have the standing to leverage, which makes her dangerous. The Alpha King has made his position clear. The Alpha King is letting a bond with an unclaimed Omega cloud his judgment. It's the mate bond. Any physician will tell you the early stages produce irrational. She stopped listening. She went back to the East Tower and administered Ori's third dose and sat with him while he ate, and he told her, with the absolute conversational confidence of a 7-year-old, that his uncle had seemed less like he had a stick in his back since yesterday. She asked what that meant. Ori considered this at length and said that Kylen usually walked like he was carrying something heavy and invisible, and that yesterday he'd walked into the room like the thing had gotten lighter. Senna said. Do you know why? Ori asked. I couldn't say, she said. I think it's because you're here, he said, with the terrible directness of children. He kept saying your name when I was sick. When he thought I was asleep. He said it like Ori struggled for language, frowning. Like when I say my dad's name sometimes. Senna looked at the boy and felt something tighten in her throat. Eat your broth, she said gently. The council session was still running when the beta from the night before found her and said the Alpha King was requesting her presence in the hall. Not the East Tower. Not the study. The hall. She understood the distinction. She walked through the palace with her hands easy at her sides, her chin up, wearing what she'd arrived in, traveling clothes, practical and plain, nothing that announced claim or aspiration. She walked through the doors of the inner sanctum and found it no longer empty. The council was there, ranged along the right side of the hall. 7 of them, robes and silver chains, their faces composed into the careful blankness of people who had not yet decided what outcome they were managing. There were also 24 court members, betas and alphas, positioned through the hall in the way that suggested this had been announced, that this was being witnessed. Kylen stood at the center of the floor. He was in formal dress, the dark coat with the Ashvaran sigil, the chain of office. He looked like the Alpha King. He also, she noticed, looked like a man who had made a decision from which he intended no retreat. He held out his hand. She stopped 10 feet away from him. She was aware of the council watching. She was aware of the assembled court watching. She was aware of herself, an Omega alone in the blood court with no pack and no claim, and the specific arithmetic of what this moment was, and what it required of her. She was also aware that she had not come here to perform smallness. "Come here," he said. Not a command. Not a plea. A request, from one specific person to one specific other person, that happened to be witnessed by everyone in the hall. She crossed the remaining 10 feet. She took his hand. He turned to the council, holding her hand, and said, "This Omega came alone into the blood court to save my heir when this court could not. She has no pack standing because this court failed to give her one before it sent her away. That failure was mine. I am correcting it. My lord." The eldest councillor stepped forward. He was a grey-haired beta male with the particular expression of someone who managed power by predicting it, and who was currently watching his predictions fail. The protocols for formal mating recognition require a period of. "I'm familiar with the protocols," Kylen said. "I wrote the most recent revision of them, in the 3rd year of my rule. I am also familiar with the emergency dispensation that predates every revision, which permits the Alpha King to claim his fated mate on recognition, witnessed in open court, without a waiting period." He paused. "I've been waiting 3 years. I am done with waiting periods." Someone in the court made a sound. Not quite shock. Something closer to the release of tension that had been building since she walked through the doors. The eldest councillor looked at her. "Is the claim," he paused, recalibrating. "Does the Omega acknowledge the bond?" They were all looking at her. She felt the bond, solid and warm and roaring quiet, the most honest thing she knew. She had not come here for him. She had come despite him. She looked at Kylen. At the man who had sent her away and written 17 drafts of a letter and stood in a sick room holding the shape of his love like something he didn't know what to do with, and who was now standing in his own hall with his hand in hers asking not for forgiveness first but for the chance to prove what he'd learned. She thought, "I know what you are. I have always known what you are." She thought, "That is not the question. The question is whether I am willing to begin from here." She said, "I acknowledge the bond." Seelan's hand tightened on hers. She felt it through her whole body, the bond settling, both of them acknowledging it at once, witnessed and named and no longer deniable. Not a completion, not yet. A beginning that had been earned the hard way. The eldest councillor looked between them. Something in his face shifted, not approval, exactly, but the recognition of something he could not stop and had perhaps, somewhere under the performance of protocol, not wanted to. "The court witnesses," he said. The hall was not silent. It was the opposite of silence, a held breath released, a dozen small sounds, the rustle of people absorbing what they'd just seen. Kylen turned to her and she looked at him, and for a moment the audience and the council and the violet-lit hall ceased to matter in any functional sense. "I want to say something to you that I'm not going to manage to say correctly," he said, low enough that it was for her. "Then take your time," she said. "I knew what you were, what we were, when you were still sitting across from me in the library and pretending your hands weren't shaking. I knew it, and I chose the fear over the fact, and I sent away the only person who has ever made the inside of this court feel like something worth ruling." She looked at him. The crack she'd first seen in his face 14 years ago, the one that showed what lived under the precision, was fully open now. "How could I not have chosen this?" he said. "How could I have looked at everything you are and thought any version of this place was worth more?" She said, "You were afraid." "Catastrophically," he agreed. "Of what, exactly?" "That you'd see it and leave. Before I could lose you on my own terms." She absorbed that. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her face, and he'd been accumulating honesty for 2 days, and she could feel the weight of what it had cost him to relearn how to be a person who said true things out loud. "I did leave," she said. "You did. And you came back." He turned her hand over in his, looking at it briefly. "For a child. Not for me. Which is," he stopped. "Which is exactly who you are. The Omega who walked into the blood court alone because a child needed her, who has never once in her life measured her worth by whether a powerful man approved of it. That's a very gracious reframing of 3 years of exile, she said. It's not a reframing. It's what happened. You became, in the north, exactly who you would have been here if this court had deserved you sooner. He said it quietly and meant it completely, and she felt it go into her like light goes into a room, not warming it from the outside but changing the quality of what was already there. She said, Kylen. Yes. We have a great deal of work to do. I know. I'm not going to be a political gesture. If I'm in this court, I'm here as a full member of it, not a decoration. I'll continue my work. I'll have my own practice. I'll disagree with the council when I think they're wrong, which based on this morning, will be often. I would expect nothing else. And the child, she said. Ori. He needs stability. He needs to know what he is to you, what he is to this court. He can't spend his childhood feeling like he's being housed somewhere. He needs to know he belongs. Kylen looked at her for a long moment. That is the most important thing anyone has said to me in 3 years, he said. She believed him. She turned to the council, still holding Seelan's hand, and said, clearly enough to be heard across the hall, I'll be establishing a practice in the East Wing. Any court member, regardless of rank, may seek consultation. The court physician will remain, we'll work together, not in competition. She looked at the eldest counselor specifically. The protocols that prevented an Omega without Pack standing from practicing medicine within the blood court are 300 years old and have no medical basis. I would like a formal review within the month. The eldest counselor looked at her, then at Kylen, then back at her. Then, with the particular grace of a man who understood when the wind had changed permanently, he inclined his head. The review can be arranged, my lady. My lady. She heard the shift in the title. What it meant. She did not perform any reaction to it. She simply nodded once, in the way of someone receiving a thing that is already theirs. It was on the morning of the 5th day, Ori healthy and vocal and following Senna around the East Wing like a very determined shadow, her practice space established, the first 3 court members already having sought consultation with the careful tentative energy of people trying something new, that Kylen came to find her at the end of the East Corridor when the evening light was going red and low and the court had quieted into its nighttime register. He came without announcement, without formal dress, in the way he used to come to the library, simply arriving, as though the space pulled him. She was organizing her materials. She heard him in the doorway. You could knock, she said. The door was open. She turned around. He was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, looking at her practice space with an expression she recognized, the same expression he'd had in the library when he'd leave books he thought she'd want and then pretend to have been passing by. The expression of someone who liked a thing and couldn't fully hide it. It looks like you, he said. She looked at her space, the ordered rows of materials, the precise labeling, the small fire kept at a careful temperature, the window propped open to the evening air. That's either a compliment or an observation, she said. Both. She finished what she was doing and faced him. In the evening light he was not the Alpha King or the man from the study or the figure from the sickroom doorway. He was just Kylen, the way he'd been in the library, slightly unguarded, slightly uncertain, hoping something. I need to say one more thing, he said. You've been saying things for 5 days. This one is different. She waited. He crossed the room to her. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the bond between them steady and present, not demanding anything, just there in the way of something that had always been there and had learned patience. I am going to spend the rest of my life making the blood court a place that deserves you, he said. I don't know how long it will take. I imagine it will be a significant project. But I want you to know that it is not a gesture or a political decision, it is the specific thing I intend to do with my rule, now that I know what my rule is for. She looked at him for a long time. For a man who wrote 17 drafts of a letter, she said, you've gotten considerably better at saying things. I've had 5 days of practice. She reached up and put her hand on the side of his face, the same way he'd held her face in the sickroom, not as a claim, as a recognition. His eyes closed briefly. I know what you are, she said quietly. I've always known. That's not the hard part. The hard part was deciding that knowing is enough. He opened his eyes. And I have decided. She let her hand fall. I'll need a formal title. Not lady. Something accurate. Court physician would be accurate. Court physician and Omega advisor, she said. If you're doing the reform properly, You'll need someone who knows what it's like to navigate this court from the bottom of it. Done. And Ori needs a reading tutor. He told me he's been taught by 3 different people in 3 months and can't stand any of them. He told me he'd like you to do it. He told you that. This morning. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that you explained things in a way that wasn't boring. He paused. I'm told that's the highest compliment he gives. She felt something warm and unexpected move through her. I'll add it to my schedule, she said. He was looking at her with the open face, the cracked wide face, and she let herself look back at him the same way, not performing smallness, not keeping herself at the edge of the bond's range, but present and decided and exactly who she was. She was the Omega who had walked into the blood court alone. She was not going to be alone here now. Come to dinner, he said. Not a formal dinner. Just in the East Wing sitting room. Ori's been talking about you for 4 hours and I've promised him you'd eat with us. You promised without asking me. I had a reasonable degree of confidence. She picked up her satchel. You'd better be right. He smiled, and it was the cousin of the laugh she'd first heard 14 years ago in a library, and it still changed the quality of every room it entered. She walked through the door ahead of him. The evening was warm. The sconces in the corridor burned their near-violet flame. Somewhere ahead, she could hear Ori arguing cheerfully with someone about whether soup counted as a meal, his voice filling the East Wing corridor with the sound of a child who was alive and knew he was home. Senna walked toward the sound. Kylen walked beside her. The bond between them did not need to announce itself. It was simply there, the way truth is there, not requiring performance, not requiring confirmation, settled into both of them like something that had grown slowly enough to be permanent. She thought, I did not come here for him. She thought, and yet here was the East Wing lit gold in the evening, and a child's voice insisting on justice for soup, and Kylen beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm, and her practice established and her work ongoing and her voice already heard in the hall that had once sent her out into the cold. She had not come here for him. She had come for a dying child, and the child lived, and she had stayed for everything else. The door to the East Wing sitting room was open. Ori was cross-legged on the hearthrug making his case to a young beta attendant who was losing the argument badly. When Senna appeared in the doorway, he abandoned the soup debate entirely and pointed at her as though she were evidence of something. She's here, he announced, with total vindication. I'm here, she agreed, and came in and sat down on the hearthrug beside him, and the soup debate resumed with her as primary arbitrator, and Kylen sat in the chair closest to the fire and watched the two of them with the expression of someone who has been given back a thing they were certain they had forfeited and cannot yet fully believe is real. She made her ruling on the soup, it counted, she said, as a meal if it contained sufficient substance, and this one did, and the argument was therefore settled, and Ori accepted her verdict with the solemnity of a king and then immediately moved on to asking her if the remedy she'd used had a smell because he'd been too sick to notice, but the attendant had said it smelled like something. Like pine, she said. And something underneath that's harder to name. What's the harder to name thing? She thought about it. The compound she developed through 4 months of careful work in the Northern Archives, distilled from a knowledge she'd built alone in the cold, out of necessity and grief and the stubborn insistence on being useful. Home, she said. It smells a little bit like home. Ori considered this with deep seriousness, then nodded and went back to his soup. Kylen looked at her across the fire. She looked back. Outside the blood court's walls the night was cold and vast and full of the history of every Omega who had never walked those halls alone and lived to eat soup by a hearthfire with a king who had learned, late and at real cost, what it meant to be worthy of the mate the moon had chosen for him. Inside those walls, in a room that smelled like pine and fire and the particular warmth of a family assembling itself out of unlikely parts, Senna sat on the hearthrug beside a 7-year-old who had decided she belonged to him, and she let herself feel the full weight of the bond without managing it down to something manageable, without keeping herself at its edges. It was not comfortable, being fully claimed by something so large. It was also not frightening, not anymore. It was simply true. She reached across to the low table and took a piece of bread and ate it, and the fire crackled, and Ori said something that made her laugh, and Kylen leaned forward to say something quiet and only for her, and she turned toward him the way she had always turned toward him, the way she'd turned toward the door the first time he walked into the library from the training yard, as though she'd always known the direction of him, as though her whole body had been oriented toward him since long before she understood what that meant. She let it. She was done managing the distance. The Blood Court had never had an Omega walk into it alone and leave with everything. Senna, it turned out, was not going to leave. She was going to stay, and work, and argue with the council when they were wrong, and teach a 7-year-old to read, and build a practice in the East Wing, and love a man who had learned to be worthy of it. She was going to do all of this as exactly who she was, not small, not managed, not performing any version of herself designed to fit a space that had once been built too narrow. The Blood Court would need to widen to hold her. She had every intention of making sure it did.